and greetings to all on behalf of my co-chairs, Celia Naylor, and our colleagues in Africana Studies. Welcome to the 2022 Lewis-Ezekoye Distinguished Lecture in Africana Studies, delivered tonight by Professor Chanda Prescod Weinstein. Before she speaks, we have the honor of having both our President, Sion Bylock, and Provost, Linda Bell, join us to add their welcome. They will be followed by the two women for whom the lecture series is named, Denise Jackson-Lewis and Lewis-Ezekoye, both class of 66, and they will make their brief welcome. You might say that tonight is a convergence, a kind of earthly alignment of stellar leadership. There is the spirit of an enduring friendship that has led us to tonight through the endowment of this lecture series. It aligns with the unparalleled leadership of our president and provost during the imperfect storm of a pandemic and spectacularly renewed racial and political violence. The third alignment is, of course, the leading scholarship of Professor Prescod Weinstein, who looks into the depths of the universe and does not tremble. So let us set this alignment in motion in a wonderful way by welcoming President Bylock. President Bylock, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Christianse. It's so wonderful to be here. And this is such a special event. It's actually the first event of 2022 of our Barnard's Year of Science. And of course, I'm especially excited that this is being hosted by the Africana Studies Department. Our Africana faculty do incredible work. And I think today's conversation is really a testament to their commitment to not only thinking inside their department, but collaborating and strengthening ties across the college and across disciplines. And I think it goes to the heart of what Barnard is. We talk about at Barnard that we're not about the liberal arts and sciences, that sciences are part of the liberal arts. And great scientists have to be great humanists in their ability to communicate, to understand text, to understand different cultures and ways of thinking. And great humanists have to be great scientists in terms of their ability to understand data, ask questions, challenge assumptions. And this is really what we're bringing to the forefront in Barnard's Year of Science. We are celebrating our eminence in sciences that really parallels our eminence in the arts and humanities and social sciences. And I can't think of a better way to do that than through the fourth iteration of the Lewis-Ezekoye Distinguished Lecture in Africana Studies. This is endowed by Denise Lewis, class of 66, in honor of her friendship with her classmate, Lewis-Ezekoye. And it really illustrates the symbiosis of friendship at Barnard and this willingness to really push boundaries of how we think about what knowledge is, where it comes from, and how it contributes to our day-to-day functioning. I'm so honored that we are able to showcase a physicist, Professor Prescod Weinstein, and in a department like Africana Studies. And it really is fantastic that this department brings together faculty from social sciences, from humanities, to really engage in the best scholarship around diversity, enhanced research, pedagogy, cultural questions, history, English, and so many more. And so I'm excited now to be here to welcome you all, to turn it over next to our Provost and Dean of the Faculty, Linda Bell. And I can't wait for our lecture tonight. Provost Bell.
Thank you. Thank you, President Bylock. And thank you, Professor Christianse and members of the Africana Studies Department for inviting me here this evening. While I have the stage, I want to thank Professor Christianse for her leadership in Africana Studies over several years now, as well as her leadership across the college. It has been an extraordinary period for all of us, and we couldn't have survived without the kind of faculty support and leadership that, Professor Christianse exemplifies so well. It is really my pleasure to be here to add my welcome to President Bylock's. This annual Lewis-Ezekoye Distinguished Lecture was inaugurated in 2018. I think I've had the pleasure and honor to be here every year to just offer my welcome. It is a very meaningful lecture for Barnard. in showcasing the strength of the Barnard Africana Studies Department, in showcasing its kind of intellectual reach, its heft, its ability to kind of bring scholars together in very varied and important discourse. As President Bylock mentioned, the endowment that supports this lecture was forged of a very important friendship. And as important as our academic program is to our success here at Barnard, it clearly is the mainstay of our reputation. So too is the kind of community that Barnard is, that creates and affords the opportunity for these friendships. So the nature of the orientation of this lecture is so appealing and in so many ways. And for any of you students who might be on the line and listening to the lecture this evening, I encourage you to think about the enduring and transformative power of the kinds of relationships you're able to forge while you're here, to cherish those and to grow those and to deepen those throughout your life, because what you learn at Barnard doesn't stop with Barnard. It continues long after. Before closing, I'd just like to add my appreciation as well to President Bylock for this unique contribution tonight to Barnard's Year of Science. It's been a spectacular adventure already, and it's wonderful to have Professor Weinstein here this evening to talk with us. So Prescod Weinstein. So I will end with that, with a warm welcome to Professor Prescod Weinstein, and with a great thank you to all of those involved in this evening's very important event. And then finally, a thank you to Denise Jackson Lewis and Lewis-Ezekoye for making this event possible, and for coming back every year to be with us to celebrate it. Thank you.
Hello all, I'm Denise Lewis, and welcome to those joining us from across the United States and internationally. Thank you to President Bylock and Provost Bell for your very generous words. We look forward to this lecture every year with great excitement and with anticipation, because it represents for us a critical coming together. We are here from different places, from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, but we come together to discuss and debate challenging topics. We convene each year to learn from the best and the brightest of thinkers that have their descendancy from the African continent. That is the essence of the reason that we established this lectureship in 2018. We wanted the Barnard and Columbia communities and our wider community to have the exposure to diverse thought. That was sadly not the case when I was a student here at Barnard many years ago. However, the opportunities are much richer now, and we are adding to that richness. Through the tireless work of the Africana Studies Department, we are able to embrace the contributions of the entire human family, including voices whose heritage traces to the African continent. We are particularly proud, as you've heard, that this year's lecture will contribute to the Barnard campus-wide Year of Science. It's made a powerful contribution with Professor Prescod Weinstein's stimulating presentation to the physics department in a lecture she gave this afternoon. And her lecture tonight promises to be thought-provoking indeed. We so appreciate the Africana Studies faculty and staff for helping us meaningfully advance our goals for this lectureship. Professor Christianse and Professor Naylor have our deep and sincere appreciation. Our deep appreciation also to very special family, friends, dear classmates, and colleagues who have supported us on this lectureship journey, and journey it has been, and their support has been financial and otherwise. Special thanks to the McGregor Fund and their leadership for contributing to the lectureship over the years. This journey began with a friendship formed at Barnard from our days as freshmen. We will now hear from the co-founder of the lectureship, Lewis-Ezekoye. The bond we formed, crossing it did from the Atlantic, going from Nigeria to Michigan. And we share that spirit with you today. Adeze.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you all who have spoken before. I know you want to hear the professor, but you got to hear me first. I add my welcome to those that you've already heard. And I'm reminded today, as we hear all of this, about the recent retirement of the first African-American NHL hockey player, Willie O'Ree, who said he joined the NHL because he loved to play hockey and because he wanted to be, not because he wanted to be the first African-American in the NHL. Similarly, I thought about Denise from Michigan and me from Nigeria and our instant friendship and lifetime bonding. It was, people talk about as freshmen, we met on our second day on campus. We came to Barnard as teenagers because we wanted an education. Our families wanted that for us also. We didn't know that Barnard had a quota of 4 African Americans for our class. We didn't know that I would possibly be the first Black African at Barnard. We just wanted an education. What we did know was that all kinds of possibilities existed, and we were open to education, knowledge, and learning of what was happening at Barnard and in the world around us. And at that time, it was freedom riders, getting people registered to vote in the South of the United States, decolonization and independent movements throughout the Third World, and outer space adventures captivating the whole world. Our bonding has led to this lectureship, bringing to life what we have known. There are hidden figures, fantastic hidden figures in various fields, in the arts, the humanities, the sciences, and our hope is to showcase them to wider audiences. We are fortunate that we have a special lecturer today. Although she talks about dark spaces and so on, she's not going to be hidden to many of you after today. And we're very fortunate that she's Professor Chanda Prescod Weinstein is going to be speaking to us. We thank you so much for your continued support. It's not only in the sciences, we're happy for that, but from the arts and all different fields, we hope to be able to continue our special lectureship for some time, and we appreciate your support. Welcome once again, and I'll turn over back to Professor Christiansen so we can get on with the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise and Adeze, and thank you, Provost Bell. Perhaps some of us remember taking a flashlight and pointing it into the night sky when we were children, and wondering where that tiny light beam was going. Did our young selves find the words for those questions? What was out there where it went? Chanda Prescod Weinstein has been finding those words. To see and be inspired by the universe as it really is, she has written, should be a human right, not a luxury for a chosen few. This is about, as she also writes, access to the night sky. Black feminist, theorist, theoretical physicist, assistant professor of physics and astronomy, and women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire, member of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory Dark Matter Working Group, and author of the award-winning Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Spacetime, and Dreams Deferred. Professor Prescod Weinstein looks to the sky and remembers that she is grounded in the relation between her scientific pursuit, the metaphysical questions about living in the wake of the Black Atlantic, colonialism's long reach, and yes, education in which there should be a universe of possibilities. And with that, Professor Weinstein, good evening.
Oh my goodness. You all are such a tough act to follow. So let me start by making sure that everyone can see my slides. I'm going to assume that everyone can see it unless somebody jumps in and tells me you can't see what's going on. So let me start by thanking Denise Lewis and Lewis-Ezekoye for endowing this, and also for the example of your friendship. I think that Black women uplifting Black women is a key Black feminist survival strategy. And it's beautiful to see it in public in this way. I want to thank Professors Christianse and Naylor and Roland for helping to pull this event together, and for everyone, including, I don't know if it's been articulated, there are closed captions available. So I want to thank the captioner also. So I'm going to talk to you all today about Black feminism in space. There will be time for questions at the end. So I look forward to hearing the questions. And so I'm just going to get underway. So I want to start with a fundamental premise that I think from, which is that the night sky and our relationship to it is part of humanity. And my case for this is that we evolved under the night sky. It has always been there for a long time. We didn't necessarily build very elaborate structures to be away from it in the evenings. We are also a storytelling species, and the night sky figures in those stories. And that is true. Anywhere that you find people, there are stories about the night sky and our relationship to it, our place in it. And that is to say that cosmological storytelling is part of who we are as human beings. The way that I tend to think of this is in particular through the lens of the Black feminist philosopher of science, Sylvia Wynter, in conversation with Black feminist theorist Catherine McKittrick, where Sylvia Wynter says the paleontologist Juan Luis Arzuaga proposes that the human is not only a languaging being, but also a storytelling species. And so Professor Wynter says, in her own terms, that the human is Homo narrans. So this means that as a species, we're hybrid. And what I want to lead people to is the idea that to be cut off from the night sky is to be cut off from our humanity. So it is natural for us to take an interest in space. It is natural. And I think as much as we can criticize universalism, I think that it is universal to take an interest in the night sky and to be interested in what is beyond the Earth's atmosphere. So I'm going to start by giving you that context, just basically telling you what I want you to be thinking about by the end of this talk. So space is a site of our freedom dreams, and whether you include yourself in our I leave that up to you. But it is a space for our freedom dreams. And I truly mean this, and the reference here for people is Robin D.G. Kelly's book. Space is a site of their colonial dreams. So if you need an example of who I mean by there, let's say Elon Musk, AKA, as Azealia Banks humorously called him, Apartheid Clyde. Black feminism, what I want to argue in part is that Black feminism provides an analytic guide that points toward freedom. And that includes space, and space as a site of our freedom dreams. It might not be the only place where we do freedom dreaming, but it is one of the places where we not only project our freedom dreams, but where we actually go as part of our freedom dreams to live them. So that was like an incredible introduction. And I can't say enough genuinely how honored I am to be recognized by the incredible women who spoke before me. I'm going to reintroduce myself which is mostly to say, so I'm mostly a dark matter theorist. And so I just want to start, particularly for the students in the audience, I majored in physics and astronomy in college and never took a gender studies class. I actually didn't even take like an Africana studies class. I'm in a lot of ways self-taught. I'm trained as a scientist. And so there are a lot of different directions you can go in. So I just want to remind the students of that. I'm one of about 100 Black American women with a PhD from a department of physics, and I was probably the University of Waterloo's first. In Canada, most of the institutions don't keep track of demographic information, and so it was unmarked when I graduated. And actually, it continues to be the case that University of Waterloo is unsure. They've been unable to find a graduate before me, but they continue to be unsure. I'm also the first Black woman to hold a tenure-track faculty position in either theoretical cosmology or particle theory. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are covered in my book. I just published last year, The Disordered Cosmos, Journey into Dark Matter, Spacetime, and Dreams Deferred. Not surprisingly, I'm also the first Black woman to publish a book on cosmology or particle physics. So I'm making a point of articulating all the different ways that someone like me is seen as a first, as a barrier breaker. But part of why I'm making this point is that it's important to understand that we have the record keeping that we do now and the ways in which we are barrier breakers. And the way that we just heard about the quota system that Barnard used to have and about the journey it must have involved. I feel like y'all could just have a lecture where it's just the two of you talking, I have to say. I've being among the only Black students, and I think even today students are still having that experience, even as there are many more. But it's important to remember that we are part of a long tradition. And so even though there are many ways in which I am a barrier breaker, I am part of a long tradition of Black scientific thought. So the slide has a few different things going on. But part of what I want you all to see is the different ways that we can slice this. So Francois Fournier de Pasquet was a French and Haitian doctor during an era of great upheaval in both countries. Solomon Brown was a self-taught zoologist. In the 20th century, we had Marie Maynard Daly, who was a biochemist. Someone that I like to highlight is Elmer Imes. So for people who are interested in literature, he was married to Nella Larson, who's the author of Passing, for anybody who's been paying attention to the incredible discourse about that phenomenal novel. Elmer Imes was also one of the first people to provide key evidence that quantum mechanics was the correct theory of reality at microscopic scales. And that's something that's not well known. So there are ways in which I'm a barrier breaker, but I'm also part of this long tradition, including reaching back to the antebellum era. When we think about what was required to run a plantation, we're talking about many unnamed enslaved engineers, plant biologists, midwives, agriculturalists. I feel like I always have to remind people that some of those folks were women, because I think when you name those words, that often what comes to mind is men. And it's important also to remember that science isn't something that was new to Africa when Europeans became more involved in the continent, but there are people across the continent, across the communities who understood vaccination-like ideas, devised astronomical systems, and more. So again, I articulate myself as a barrier breaker in some ways, but I'm also part of a very long tradition. And when we talk about education and the kinds of education that we are getting on our campuses, I think it continues to be today that there are so many hidden figures, and they're hidden by so many different things, including the legacy of slavery. And so one of the lessons that we can take from this is that science is shaped by the stories we tell about who matters and whose ideas count. So does it matter that you knew what you were doing with a crop? We're talking about, for example, people who could build things on the plantation, even though they didn't have the resources or the education to calculate on paper. So let me tell you all, as a theoretical physicist whose job is to do math all day, that I can barely do math in my head. So the idea of doing that your entire life, like we're talking about incredible levels of brilliance and intellectual capacity that went unrecognized. So when we talk about what counts as science and who counts as a scientist, this is intimately connected with our stories about who matters and whose ideas count. Thinking about this, so what I'm showing you here is a photo of me holding a painting. You can see the painting is also behind me here in my home office. When I finally got a faculty position, and I was a postdoc for 8 years, so there were points at which I didn't think I was going to become a professor. I wanted to have something that reminded me of the ancestors whose journey I was continuing. And in particular, I was very interested in thinking about the idea of unnamed enslaved Black women who did scientists anyway and who looked at the stars anyway. So I went to the brilliant painter, Lewis-Ezekoye. She's an Atlanta-based painter. I encourage people to check out her website. And I said to her, I was like, I want a painting of the Black women scientists who survived slavery, whose names we will never know. And she said, okay, give me some pictures that are related to your work. And so I sent her some gravitational lensing. So that's a reference for Professor Christianse, because we were talking about gravitational lensing before the lecture started. And so you can see the arcs of the lensing and the galaxies in the background in this painting. These women are doing chemistry in the kitchen, even as they're dealing with the clothing. And the point is that we looked up, our ancestors looked up, that never stopped, even after the kidnappings, even after the transatlantic slave trade, even after colonialism on the continent. And for people who really want to think about this, an important reference, I think, at this point is Robert Jones Jr.'s incredible new novel, The Prophets, which I have to say, it just came out in paperback. I really encourage people to read it, but it's a deep meditation in part on our relationship to the night sky and the cosmos. So again, I am part of a long tradition. Professor Christianse said something along the lines that I look deep into the cosmos and I do not tremble. And that is because I come from a long line of Black women who look deep into the cosmos and did not tremble. It is important to recognize that when we're talking about the history of science and the legacy of our ancestors in science, that it is also the case that our ancestors, our forebears, have had to make contributions to science involuntarily against their will. And so the most famous example that I think people in the New York area are particularly familiar with is the case of J. Marion Sims, who is often referred to as the father of gynecology, who experimented on unanesthetized enslaved Black women, the three whose names that are recorded are Anarcha Westcott and Betsy and Lucy. And he didn't believe that Black women felt pain or that enslaved women were fully people, even though clearly they had the anatomy of people that he was interested in. This story is, it's a horror story, right? What was done to these women. It is also the case that even though they did not volunteer for it, that they and their bodies, their literal bodies, made contributions to science. And so that is the other side. There is, and this is one of the reasons I put science in air quotes, is it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When we think about what science is and what science can be, there is sometimes an enormous human rights distance between what we want it to be, what it should be, what it could be, and what it has been. So when we think about what it means to engage our ancestral heritage as people who do rational knowledge production about the world, we're called to think about what are the ethics, what is the analytic framework through which we can think about doing that work, such that the horrors that people like monsters like Sims, I should really say, visited on people like Anarcha and Betsy and Lucy. How do we build that world where this is never what science is again? So in a lot of ways, in the United States and North America, and more broadly across the Americas, we are living in the wake of slavery. As Christina Sharp has put it, we are living in the wake of the plantation. And we continue to live with what some scholars have been articulating as plantation politics. And so I point to this quote from a recent book called Plantation Politics and Campus Rebellions that was edited by Squire, Williams, and Tuitt. And in the introduction, Williams and Tuitt say that plantation politics is the connection between historical policies, practices, and discourses in higher education and their new iterations, which are used to control, exploit, and marginalize Black people. So testimony about these experiences in higher education, you just jump on social media, you follow a Black woman academic, and at some point she's going to be talking about something that relates to what these folks are calling plantation politics. It's not just a problem in academia. It happens to be that this is the labor space that I am most familiar with, and so that's where I speak from. But I want to be really clear that this is not only an academic problem, but it continues to be that our society is grappling with the logics of the plantation. And that is one of the reasons that the Black Lives Matter movement continues to be such an important movement. And I don't mean the organization, I really mean the movement for Black lives as an idea, as a collective of people who are struggling against the logics of the plantation that continue with us today as we live in the wake of slavery. So I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that we all live on a plantation. Most of us don't. I say most of us don't because incarcerated folks, I think, arguably do. Slavery continues to be legal in prisons. And this is one of the reasons that prison abolition is so important, because the plantation lives on in our mass incarceration system. It is also important to recognize that our economy is made out of the plantation economy on stolen land, right? And so again, we continue to live with the logics and in the aftermath of the plantation. And that's another reason why I think plantation politics is a very interesting way of thinking about this. I also realize that I'm speaking very much from a perspective that is centered on the Americas. And I would say I'm still very much a beginner in my journey of understanding the different experiences that people around the continent of Africa have had. But I know that there are versions of this that people are still grappling with in the post-colonial era. And so even though I speak primarily from the experience of those of us who are on the America's side of the Atlantic, I know that this is not something that is only rooted in our geography. I also want to point out that some of this, these struggles are not just about those of us who are articulated as Black African descendants. So what I'm showing you here is an image of women who are opposing the building of the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. So these are Kanaka Maoli women. These are Native Hawaiian women. The idea of the plantation is not just present for those of us who are descendants of slaves in the Americas or descendants of people who survived colonialism in Africa, but also, for example, our kin in Hawaii and broadly in the Pacific Islands, who in fact still live on islands where there are places that are referred to as plantations. So our struggles are linked. And I think it's important to recognize that Black feminist analysis, while it is rooted in coming from the experiences of Black women, Black gender nonconforming people, that it doesn't have to just live in a bubble where it is only relevant or important or valuable for Black people. But I think it can have something to say more broadly for the community. And similarly, I think that we have a lot to learn from Indigenous feminisms, and I've been trying to do that work. So the main thing that I want people to take away from this section of the talk is, do we live and do science in the wake of slavery and ongoing colonialism? Yes, right? So whether you agree that we should be calling it plantation politics, that some of us are living on a plantation and some of us aren't, whatever, the key piece is that we live in the wake of slavery and we live in the wake of ongoing colonialism. We continue to live with ongoing colonialism. And as we all live with this, this means that those of us who are doing science are doing science with this. So the question is, what are we going to do? If science is one of our languages, if it's one of the things that we do as Homo narrans, where we tell stories about the universe, where cosmological storytelling is part of who we are, but we are also doing science enmeshed with these systems that have been violent and destructive and built without us in mind, what are we going to do? And so that is the question that I have been asking myself for a long time. For the last over 20 years, as I've been going through higher education, then as a postdoc and as a professor, what are my responsibilities? And how can we build the world again that puts these things in the past and takes the lessons from them and also honors the people who survived the atrocities of the past while looking forward and freedom dreaming, and not just dreaming, but living those freedom dreams. So I want to make sure that we all have kind of a shared vocabulary for Black feminist thought. So this is going to be one of the more verbose slides that I'm taking from Patricia Hill Collins's book, Black Feminist Thought. So this is my summary of kind of the 6 qualities that Hill Collins says that Black feminist thought has. So 1, it recognizes the significance of US Black women's thought as arising from their position as an oppressed group. And so the first thing that should jump out to you about this is that one of the critiques that's been made of Hill Collins's articulation of Black feminist thought is it ignores the transnational exchange. It ignores the massive influence that Latino Americano and Caribbean folk, Black folk have had, that you can't really separate these things out. So I just want to acknowledge that. She also talks about the way that Black feminist thought connects Black women's experiences with the ideas that arise out of these experiences. So theorizing from a particular social location. She talks about, and this is important, that Black women are not a homogenous group, but nonetheless tend to hold a shared standpoint that produces collective resistances. So we are not all the same. I was actually just recently rereading June Jordan's report from Bahamas 1982, and it's like such a brilliant essay on this point. So I just want to put out there that if you're thinking about these challenges of the differences between us, particularly those of us who are, from different sides of the same border, that's a really, really beautiful essay. She also talks about the importance of African-American intellectuals merging action and theory to support ourselves and our communities. And so there's a point here about the unique responsibility that Black intellectuals take on within the academy of bringing action and theory together, and not just, keeping our heads down, or as we say it in science, we don't just shut up and calculate because we remember where we came from and our responsibility to community. Part of Black feminist thought is recognizing that social justice change is a presumed feature. So Black feminist thought isn't here for the status quo. It's about change. And that this is a presumed feature and outcome. We're doing Black feminist thought because change is necessary. That is the end goal. And Black feminist thought is always aware of the matrix of domination. So there's a lot of talk these days about intersectionality. People hear the matrix of domination, even though it was coined almost literally in the same year as intersectionality. I actually like matrix of domination. It's really gets you thinking, and maybe this is because I'm a physicist and I do a lot of linear algebra with matrices. But I think it's really valuable to think about how the levers of power are distributed. And so the matrix of domination is really thinking about the complexity of how power is distributed. One of the beautiful things about this being, in particular, the Lewis-Ezekoye lecture, is that part of this is the coming together of two women who came from two different countries, but ultimately were engaging in a kind of collectivity through their friendship. So I'm just going to theorize, y'all, like in real time, but engaging in a collectivity through their friendship, but also through the impact that you are now having on Barnard College through this lecture series, through helping to select speakers to have a particular impact on the environment. There's potentially a power dynamic associated with one being from Nigeria, one being from the US, and that sort of thing. So the matrix of domination is really thinking through what are those differences. And Black feminist thought, coming back to point 3, is that we are not homogenous, but we are nonetheless in this together, and we are going to work together. So naturally, the question that I ask as a Black woman located in particle physics and theoretical cosmology is, what does Black feminist thought have to say about science? Because even when I didn't know to say the phrase Black feminist thought or the phrase Black feminism, I knew that I needed it. So clearly it has to have something to say, because I, as a Black woman scientist, knew that I needed it. And so again, I just repeat what I said earlier, that science as a community, as a set of practices, as a set of outcomes, as a collection of information, is shaped by the stories we tell about who matters and whose ideas count. Black feminism provides a framework for thinking about that. Okay, so I now have to have like a little bit of an interlude, because one of the things that happens, particularly when I'm talking to scientists or when others are talking to scientists, is that scientists get really worked up. They're like, so are you saying that like Black people have like a different theory of gravity, or that like they experience gravity differently? So I want to be really clear that nobody's saying that the laws of physics change because of Black feminism. Maybe our understanding of physics will change because Black feminism opens doors for more people to contribute to physics. But universality, the idea that the laws of physics are the same everywhere, is different from objectivity, right? So the laws of physics are true everywhere in the universe. I have no dispute with that. Objectivity is an unbiased perspective. So that's about our ability to perceive those laws of physics. And we bring biases to the table, to say the least, right? So I just want to be really clear about that for anybody who's getting nervous. That I'm doing anything wonky with the physics. So I mentioned a moment ago that maybe Black feminism opens doors in a way that allows Black women, Black people, other people who are not what you might call the ideal patriarch, to make contributions to physics. And so part of the work that I have done in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies is articulate this idea of what I call white empiricism. So what you're looking at here is a diagram of the white empiricism cycle. And so I just want to point people to, we're going to start with the ideal patriarch is the ideal physicist. So the ideal patriarch is an idea that I took from Imani Perry's Vexy thing, which is like such a beautiful introduction to Black feminism. So if anybody wants to know where to get started, she wrote that book with people who might be outsiders in mind. But basically the idea is that the ideal patriarch is the person who can own property, who is a person under the idea of the state in the 16th century. So a white man who's a property owner, ostensibly in our terms today, heterosexual, cisgender. We have our own version of what the ideal patriarch is, which continues to largely map onto white men. And generally speaking, het cis white men who are able-bodied, although we know that that is not a perfect mapping. Stephen Hawking got quite far as a very visibly disabled person. So the white empiricism cycle, as I think about it, is that we have this idea that the only person who makes the ideal physicist is the ideal patriarch. So those two things are married together. So then the ideal patriarch's ideas, by definition, always merit consideration because he's considered the ideal rational thinker. And this means if he's the ideal rational thinker, that means that the ideal patriarch is never biased against Black women because he's just being rational. He can't be biased. That means that Black women who challenge the ideal patriarch's self-assessment as never biased. So Black women who identify microaggressions, who identify structural racism, are then in this context fundamentally articulated and defined as people who can't be objective. We're not capable. And in the context of doing physics, being objective, your ability to have an unbiased perspective on the material is one of the key intellectual qualities. And so I remember the ethno-astronomer and historian of astronomy, Jarita Holbrook, one of the, under 30 Black American women with a PhD from a department of astronomy, pointing out to me that Black students are often getting this message of well, if you notice racism and white people think the racism isn't real, you're also regularly getting the message that you're not capable of rational thought. And that's really an attack on your most fundamental scientific tool. And so what this means is that Black women are not good physicists, right? And so I picked Black women as the group to think with here because, again, as the Combahee River Collective urges us, I started by thinking from my location, my social identity, the ascribed identities I think with. I don't think Black women are the only folks that this happens to, but I think that thinking with Black women is a particularly good starting place because there are so many ways in which Black women and more broadly gender minorities, Black gender minorities, are often the people who are least envisioned as competent, least envisioned and most distanced away from the ideal patriarch. And I think in a lot of ways, the same thing applies to women who are indigenous in some way to the Americas. And keeping in mind, of course, that Black women in the Americas are descendants of people who are indigenous to Africa. So for people who are interested in reading more about that, there was a paper published in the journal Science in 2020, Making Black Women Scientists Under White Empiricism. But part of what I want to highlight for people here in this white empiricism cycle is the end product is that you think, oh, identity has nothing to do with science, but you have this cycle that's literally spitting prospective scientists out. And naturally, their ideas are going with them. And so for people who are not familiar with how academic environments work, that means there's no one to advocate for your papers. There's no one to advocate for the lines of thought you were developing. Those are literally lines of thought that people stop thinking about. And so that is what we would call in social epistemology, in the area of philosophy where I do work, that is an epistemic outcome. It is a knowledge-based outcome. It affects what we know about the physical world because there are certain lines of thought about the physical world that are getting dropped. So Black feminism is an essential practice in science because Black feminism provides us with a guide to fight back against things like white empiricism. So, just thinking about the implications, science is not immune to white supremacy. I hope that that is starting to become manifest, and not even in physics. And one of the reasons that physics is important to think with is that for a long time, physics has been treated like the king of the sciences, and the gendering of that monarch is relevant. If even physics is not immune, none of the sciences are immune, so the story goes. I think it's important to say that white empiricism is a form of anti-empiricism because it literally requires the discarding of data, and it requires the discarding of observers who may contribute valuable data. white empiricism doesn't just affect Black women, as I mentioned before. So I think a really good example that I'm interested in thinking through in some of my future work is like, how do we evaluate Indigenous challenges to activities like the building of the 30-meter telescope, where I think white empiricism strongly shapes the debate, even in the articulation of the Kiai, the protectors who are opposing the building of the telescope, as irrational, anti-science spiritualists. That is a largely white community defining Indigenous perspectives on their terms rather than on the terms of the Indigenous people who are talking about sovereignty, who are talking about their water, who are talking about over a century of colonialism. And there is a way in which white empiricism is at work here when certain perspectives are just discarded as less valuable and labeled as something that is not worth respect. So this is, in some sense, one of the reasons that the 30-meter telescope is relevant here is because the telescope actually has the potential to take incredible images of space and to be part of our cosmological storytelling. So there is this question of what does it mean to have a relationship with space that is not mediated through colonialism, that is not mediated through white supremacy. Taking Black feminism into space means refusing white empiricism and, more broadly, white supremacy here on Earth. So we cannot go to space to escape, because we will take our problems with us. And so that means that we also have to take our solutions with us. We have to take Black feminism into space. And that means engaging with Black feminism here on Earth. So what you're looking at here is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. I strongly encourage people to look up the Hubble Ultra Deep Field because it is so detailed and so rich that without zooming in on it, you're actually missing a bunch of the stuff that's in this image. But what you're looking at is a whole mess of galaxies, a whole mess of galaxies. So a lot of these small spots. You see that little spiral, the little spiral, the little spiral. This is like, I could spend a lot of time talking to you about this image, but for people who came to the 1 o'clock talk, you saw some of it. The reason that I'm pulling up this image now is that I want to remind people what it means to experience that wonder and that awe looking at the night sky. And so when I was starting my postdoc at MIT, a distinguished astronomer there, Paul Schechter, was like, you really shouldn't be a theorist, you should become an observer. And he took me on a 10-day observing run in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And so I spent 10 days for the first time really seeing the night sky. And one night, Paul took me around the mountain, was introducing me to people and showing me the older telescopes. We were at 6.5 meter telescopes, but there were a bunch of smaller ones at the Las Campanas Observatory. And he took me up the stairs on one of them, and we just stood there and looked at the stars together. And he was telling me about the quality of the seeing, the quality of the sky there. And I looked up and I realized that my ancestors had seen a sky like this like all the time. And that because I had grown up in smoggy East LA in an urbanized, industrialized environment, that I had no idea of how extraordinary the sky was. And that my relationship to the universe had been fundamentally altered by having a childhood where I was very cut off from this incredible night sky. It was really, I don't think I said anything to him about it at the time, but it was a really life-altering moment, because in that moment, I realized that part of living in the wake of slavery was living in the wake of not having access to this type of night sky, of not having the experience of growing up with this thing that my ancestors had evolved under. And that for generations, people in our communities had been cut off from it, had been told not to look up, that it wasn't for them. And this was part of what started me on the path of the painting that Shaniqua and I collaborated on. And by collaboration, I mean, I suggested an idea and then she did brilliant things without me. This is still the piece that is inside of us And it exists beyond all of the white supremacist crap that I was just talking to you all about. And so again, for me, the motivation is, how do we develop a relationship with this night sky that's not mediated by white supremacy, that's not mediated by colonialism? Part of the realization I had that night was that it was important for children to have access to a dark night sky, and that creating the conditions under which children could access the dark night sky required actually radically revising the way that resources are distributed in our society. Because when you think about what it would require to ensure that every Black child, every Indigenous child, every child broadly to have access to a dark night sky, to really sit and just wonder under it the way that Paul and I were doing that night. They have to have food security. They can't be hungry. You can't focus when you're hungry. Housing security. You can't be worried about where you're going to sleep. You need to be well rested. Clean water so that they're not poisoned. Sovereignty, and sovereignty in a very broad way, to be able to have pride and faith and connection with your ancestral culture, your ancestral community. Clear skies, right? We can't see a dark night sky if they're deeply polluted. This means also true accessibility, right? So if someone needs like a certain type of wheelchair so that they can get out onto that ground, then they need that wheelchair. We need public transportation that will get that wheelchair there so that people can afford to go out there. They need vehicles that will have the capacity to carry them. We need transformative justice and prison abolition. And you might think, like, what does that have to do with every child accessing a dark night sky? But we know that our current approach to justice denies children childhoods by wreaking havoc on their families. And so prison abolition is absolutely a children's issue. And it is therefore absolutely an issue when it comes to creating broad, full access to a dark night sky. And in relation, the end of colonialism. So this is very much tied to the question of sovereignty. People need to feel connected with their land. One of the reasons that the fight about the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea in Hawaii is so important is because the Mauna is where the father, sky god Wakea, meets the earth. Kanaka Maoli had a cosmology that told them how to relate that land to the sky. And by taking it over, astronomers have, in some ways, damaged their capacity to maintain that traditional relationship. So I come to thinking about this very much through the lens of Black feminism, because this is part of my work as a Black woman scholar in the academy, is drawing connections between what I do, theory, and practice. So just to remind people of what Patricia Hill Collins said, this is me doing that in practice. So importantly, I'm part of, again, a long line of people who have been dreaming about this. So I want to point to this issue of Ebony magazine from January 1967 with Nichelle Nichols on the cover. This was right as Star Trek was premiering. I'm a big Star Trek nerd. Anybody who follows me on social media knows that I'm a Star Trek convention attending nerd. I'm actually sitting here with my Uhura Barbie and Funko Pop sitting next to me, a photo of Nichelle Nichols with her autograph on it, just outside the view of the camera. Importantly, this issue of Ebony, which I bought a copy of as a Hanukkah gift for myself this year. Inside, it hails Nichelle Nichols as Lieutenant Uhura as the first Negro astronaut, a triumph of modern day TV over modern day NASA. So importantly, we were dreaming of being up there before they would let us be up there, and sometimes had to do it on television first. And I think a lot of credit can be given to Gene Roddenberry, a white man who first conceived of casting. So he had worked with Nichelle Nichols before. And so he was the person who conceived of casting her in this role. But ultimately, Nichelle Nichols chose to stay in the role as, in many ways, a professional sacrifice for the movement. So many people have heard the story that Martin Luther King asked her not to quit the show because it was the only show he would let his children watch, because it allowed them to see us in space. In a lot of ways, I think, and I've heard her talk about this multiple times, Nichols really feels like it damaged her career and limited her options to remain in the Star Trek universe. And so I want to recognize it as a sacrifice, an incredible contribution. She also went on to become a recruiter for NASA, and she played a major role in recruiting the first non-white astronauts who flew for NASA. One of those people who was deeply influenced by Nichelle Nichols as a recruiter and also as Lieutenant Uhura on the Star Trek series was Dr. Mae Jemison. So Dr. Mae Jemison became the first Black woman from anywhere on planet Earth to fly in space in 1992. And something that I didn't know about until recently, when I read an interview that Nikki Giovanni did with her in Essence magazine in April 1993, yes, I've collected that issue too, is that when Dr. Jemison went, she took with her an AKA banner, a declaration from the DuSable Museum in Chicago. And she also took with her a flag that had flown over the Organization of African Unity. So there are different ways that we have already been doing this freedom dreaming, whether it is through like Afrofuturist television, whether it is through flying into space and carrying really these truly Black ass items into space with her. I really feel like it's horrible that we aren't told that part of the story, because it changes things a little bit. But it is also the case that Dr. Jemison flew as part of NASA, which at the time especially, but continues to be in many ways a highly militarized organization. When I was a postdoc at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, I had to go through an extensive security check, and I crossed through a guarded security booth every day that was guarded by people with guns. So when we think about like, what is the world we're trying to build, and what does it mean to have our experiences and our connection with space mediated really on some level by a gun? And so I also just want to point out that, there are other ways of thinking about being in space. So this is the incredible work of Lorna Simpson. This is, I picked this in part because it's in the Brooklyn Museum in New York, backdrop circa 1940s. You see Lena Horne on the right. I unfortunately, I couldn't figure out who the woman on the left was. But one of the things I love about Lorna Simpson's work, I'm such a huge Lorna Simpson fangirl, is the different ways that she envisions Black women in the cosmos and the cosmos in Black women. So you saw the cover of my book where it's a silhouette of the cosmos inside a Black woman. And really, in a lot of ways, the cover is derivative of Lorna Simpson's work. So I think, how do we think about the cosmos beyond this kind of pseudo-militarized situation that we find ourselves in right now? And I also want to point to the work of Mikhail Owuna, who is a Pittsburgh-based artist who has gotten me thinking about this in a different way by painting a lot of dancers and models and taking their photos under black light, under UV light, and really giving us a different vision of the cosmos inside of Black people. And so I think we're in this like really interesting and incredible moment where we are starting to ask that question of what would it mean to envision going to space in an even more radical way than Star Trek did, because in a lot of ways, Star Trek adopted that kind of, Starfleet is a military organization fundamentally. It's envisioned that way in the Enterprise series. I could give a whole talk about Star Trek. I'll stop myself. But the point is that how do we go beyond that? And so I just want to point out, Nikki Giovanni on space has really, in a lot of ways, been a very motivational thinker for me. So in her poem, Quilting the Black-Eyed Peas, We're Going to Mars, she says the trip to Mars can only be understood through Black Americans. And she's talking about difficult journeys, the ability to undertake a difficult journey that Black Americans understand because of the Middle Passage. So of course, like, you know, if I were editing Nikki Giovanni, and I'm going to be cheeky and say that I can edit Nikki Giovanni, this should really be through the Black Atlantic, that the trip to Mars can only be understood through the Black Atlantic. She also, in this great interview that you can find online with Krista Tippett and On Being, asks the question, can you imagine sex in space? And so she's talking about imagining Black pleasure in space. And she goes on to say in that interview, all my people have ever done is go forward. And so I think launching Black feminism into space is just another example of the different ways that Black communities have innovated going forward, that now we're going forward beyond the atmosphere. And so I actually talk a lot about this in a recent piece that was just published in the Baffler called Becoming Martian. So I'll just point people to that. It's available for free online. I will say, actually, it's maybe the essay that I am most proud of writing it basically in my entire life. So I hope that you will look at it, and that gives you an opportunity to see more of my thinking about this than I can present in the talk. The place where I want to land, and this is where I'm going to pull things to a close, is that if we're really going to think about Black feminism in space, and we're really going to think about what it means to bring, what does Black feminism have to say to science, why not talk about a Black feminist physics in the style of Patricia Hill Collins? So you all are actually the first audience that is seeing this framework that I've been working on. So what you're seeing here is edited pieces from a chapter that will be published in the Routledge Handbook on Intersectionality. I think it'll come out later this year or early next year. I will also be thinking about how to make sure there's an open access version that's available to anybody who reads English. So the first quality of Black feminist physics from my point of view, and really, I know this is an opening for a conversation. I don't get to define this for everyone, but I'm starting it. Black feminist physics seeks to understand how power dynamics are at work in any given system. So whether that is a human system or a physical system, because power is a fundamental thing that we teach students about in physics, and it opposes trans-misogynoirist distributions of social power. So for people who aren't familiar with the term misogynoir, developed by my dear friend Moya Bailey, this is the particular form of misogyny that is faced by Black women, and I think she would be okay with me saying, and more broadly, gender minorities, so including gender non-conforming people, or folks who identify as trans, but not necessarily as women, including potentially trans men. Two, Black feminist physics recognizes that complexity is normative. So that means complexity in our ideas. And Black feminist physics emerges through understanding the experiences of Black women, femmes, gender nonconforming people, and anyone else who transgresses the bounds of cis manhood, and particularly white cis manhood. But I'm going to focus especially on those of us who are Black. So we are complex. We come from the Black Atlantic is a complex community. Those of us who are in North America and including in the United States are complexly comprised. And we recognize that that's who we are. We are not a monolith, and that our complexity is normal. Solidarity forms a key piece of Black feminist physics. So that means we are collectively resistant to oppression, even across and through differences. And so, for the people who live online, we hear a lot about diaspora wars. We have to work across and through those differences that we perceive, because solidarity is going to save us. And Black feminist physics must therefore link theory and action. And so I like to point out for the scientists, this mirrors the professional physics practice of linking experiment with theory. So this should not feel foreign to those of us who are scientists. And as professional physicists, And more broadly, as professional scientists, we have to be prepared to answer community members who ask us, what can physics do for my community? What can physics do for our community? So what does physics have to say to Black people? What does astronomy have to say to Black struggle? We should be ready to answer that question. Black feminist physics is opposed to institutionalization, and it seeks to develop tools that resist the institutionalization that has been naturalized as part of the life of the physicist. So this really means we're not here to cape for the institutions. We are here for liberation, and we will take what we need to take for liberation, but we will not be co-opted. I think that this is such a hard thing for those of us who are academics, especially I'm pre-tenure. So like, there are a lot of ways in which I need to make people at my institution happy, but I resist institutionalization. I think this is a really key piece. So finally, Black feminist physics understands itself as linked to cries for justice by other marginalized and minoritized groups in the physics community, as well as cries for justice outside of the physics community. So when I co-organized the Strike for Black Lives in June of 2020, part of what we wanted to communicate to people is that Black scientists are Black, and what happens in the Black community happens to Black scientists. We can't talk about justice in academic spaces of any kind unless we're talking about justice in all spaces. So we can't talk about, well, I want to make things better for Black women in physics unless we're talking about making things better for Black women in the world. Whether they are physicists or whether they are our mamas, our cousins, our sisters, our best friends, or just like, fellow human beings who are deserving of dignity. So I do have this chapter forthcoming, and I'm running out of time and can't say much more about it. What I do in the chapter that's not discussed here is link this to how intersectionality as an analytic framework, akin to the matrix of domination, can help us think about what it means to put Black feminist physics into practice. So some of these ideas are talked about in the Disordered Cosmos, and I know that my agent, my publicist, et cetera, would be really unhappy if I didn't advertise the book again. I know that for some folks, hardcovers are expensive, and so I love libraries. I really want to strongly encourage you to get this book out from the library if you can't afford it. And I also want to point out that the paperback is coming out on May 10th. It is updated. I made changes to the Physics of Melanin chapter. It opens completely differently now. There's also a reader's guide and a Q&A with me at the end that I'm super excited about the person who interviewed me. So I encourage people to check that out. And finally, I just want to end on this note. So we're really just beginning, but this is the end of the talk. The message that I want people to take away is that cosmological storytelling is like liberation struggle. It's fundamentally human, it's extremely Black, and they can be linked together. And I want to, just take this moment to particularly honor the Black Jacobins of today, the Haitians who are struggling for liberation and who, as I say in the dedication of my book, the République de Haiti is where our freedom began. And so the struggle of Haiti is our struggle. And I just want to acknowledge the role that Haiti in particular plays for me as a Black person who grew up in the United States and has Caribbean roots. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prescod Weinstein. And there are some questions that have come in, and they've come in both the Q&A and the chat. So just to remind everyone, you can post your questions in either space, and there are, of course, many thank yous and amazing lecture comments. So I have a first question from Maura McLean. Wonderful talk. Has the complex cosmology of the Dogon of West Africa or the night sky navigational skills that Harriet Tubman deployed made their way into astronomy curricula or the Black feminist scientist framework?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different answers I can give you there. So I mentioned Dr. Dorita Holbrook during the talk. So I want to encourage people to check out her work. Part of what Dorita has been doing over the last couple of decades is particularly for those of us who are English speakers, bringing some of those stories to the fore from the continent. So she has spent time, she was based in South Africa until recently, but she has spent time across the continent talking to astronomers. There is also now a project kicking off of people who are starting to think about developing the terminology of finding ways to create words in different languages for some of the newer scientific terms that we are working in. As for Harriet Tubman, I got really excited when you asked about that, because there's going to be a special issue of Ms. Magazine coming out later this year, and I have a contribution in it that I at least tentatively titled, I don't know what the editors are going to do with it, Harriet Tubman, Astronomer Extraordinaire. So I will just say, keep an eye out for that issue of Ms. Magazine. It's being edited by the Black feminist scholar Janelle Hobson, who has also done really incredible work. So that's coming. And I hope that people will teach that article in classes.
Thank you very much. And I know, and there are a couple of questions come up, and again, many, many more thank yous, including from our colleagues Kim Hall and Monica Miller. Sandra Bulger, I apologize if I've mispronounced your last name. For many African Americans like myself, looking up to the night sky represents the heavens and the hope from a religious standpoint, and the faith of things imagined but not yet seen, the hope for equality, the hope to be released from slavery, today's hope to be truly equal and free of injustice. Science, ancestry, and religion is connected in so many ways, as it represents the hopes, dreams, and prayers of people of color since the beginning of time. How do you see the interconnection and nexus of religion, the heavens, and the universe? For people of color, in particular Black American women, the connection is very real, if not indistinguishable in many ways.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that comes, that's such a beautiful question and way of putting it. So I just want to say thank you. And honestly, one of the first things that comes to mind, I know I sound like a total shill for my play cousin, Robert Jones Jr., but he has this really beautiful line. I won't give away where it is in the book, but he has this really beautiful line in The Prophets where he says, the cosmos are on your side. And so that was what came to mind, because I think that was what your question was talking about, is looking up at the sky and knowing that the stars are like literally cheering you on and giving you a due north, right? That Polaris is there. I'm in the disordered cosmos. So I'm a practicing Jew. I'm a member of a synagogue. I am not particularly a believer in the supernatural, but I also understand that that doesn't necessarily mean religion doesn't have a role to play in our lives. If you pick up a copy of The Disordered Cosmos, you will actually see prayers in it. So the opening opens with the Ma'ariv, which is part of the daily evening prayer, and the book ends with the Traveler's Prayer. And those were selected in conversation with my rabbi. So I guess I will say that I think that there's a role to play there. I think the message that I would want the scientists who are in the audience to hear, who maybe feel a little bit hostile to the connection between religion and science, is that people of color, in particular in the United States, especially Black people, but not only Black people, are a faithful community. A lot of people still go to church. The church is a key institution. It's a key institution that has been tied to liberation in our communities. So when we talk about what it means to open our doors and truly welcome people into science, it means welcoming people who have faith into science. So that's my position on it. I may not see faith in the same way or feel faith in the same way, but I recognize the critical importance of faith. Particularly, I was raised by a very spiritual mama. And, when I was a teenager, my mom was like, neutrinos are cool. Neutrinos are really, really cool. And I was like, I don't know. I haven't read that much about neutrinos. They're not really cool, right? So of course, neutrinos are super hip right now. And I even had a very popular op-ed last year about how neutrinos are non-trinary. So look, my spiritual mama had the number of the neutrinos before I did. And I'm the one with a PhD in theoretical physics. So it comes from all places.
Thank you so much. Now, and there are quite a few questions come in. Donna Davidson, have you read Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals by Alexis Pauline Gumbs? Barnard alum. Within this question is, if you think there are parallels to be drawn between marine biology and astrophysics. I'm hearing closely related themes of Black feminism as a filter to exploring seemingly mysterious worlds, especially considering the reference to the transatlantic slave trade, in which the transport of slaves was in relation to the skies above just as much as the waters below.
Yeah, so certainly there are connections, and I would say, like, Alexis is thinking in a different way. Primarily, I would say I don't feel like I know enough about marine biology to really answer part of that question. I think part of the role of a scientist is saying, you know, admitting when you don't know. And so I'll just be consciously incompetent and honestly incompetent on that point. I think the piece about the water, when I first read Christina Sharp's In the Wake, I actually started like messaging Christina and saying, you know, this is a science studies book, because she had these discussions about the literal wake that the ships were creating as they were transporting our ancestors across the Atlantic. And she also in kind of the same section where she's talking about engineering the boats so that the boats would be more efficient at transporting slaves, enslaved people, and the products that they were producing. She also talks about Catherine McKittrick's Mathematics Black Life. And so the way that people were doing these different messed up mathematical calculations of how much is a Black life worth economically. And so in that sense, I really think that there is a science studies question there in thinking about what is the relationship to the water, even just from a physics perspective of what does it mean for boat engineering to have been advanced literally on the backs of those who were being kidnapped and enslaved.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, there is Ayana Hinton, Dr. Prescod Weinstein. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm an academic and I wonder, do you talk about these ideas with people in your physics department, and how do they receive them?
Yeah, so I am super lucky in the physics home that I have. I'm the junior faculty in my department are actually majority women. I'm not the only queer person. There's a trans woman, and I'm the only person of color in that group, but I have found that so far they're very receptive. And so we actually talk quite openly about these things. Yesterday, we were having like a very in-depth conversation about trying to figure out how to integrate stories of Elmer Imes into the quantum mechanics classroom. And at the same time, what it would mean to address him and also address Erwin Schrödinger, who anybody who came to my talk today heard me say Schrödinger a lot. So I'm not going to say what that man did, but he was a horrible human being. And so we are having those conversations in my department. I don't hide who I am, and I actually, as part of my job interview, gave a colloquium on some of these topics. And so the department knew exactly what they were signing up for when they got me. And I would say that, not everybody's on the same page, but I don't feel like I have to hide who I am in my physics department. And I'm grateful for that.
How wonderful. How wonderful. Of course, you say that name and we all shudder. In relation to names, Maura McLean has asked, I think, a question that everybody would like to ask, or well, certainly most of us. Would it be possible to get a list of the readings that you referenced, including that forthcoming essay on Harriet Tubman? Perhaps we can work with you after this.
Absolutely. I would be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. And Sharon Harbin, has any of your research taken you to the Aboriginal culture and the dreamings of their untrained, trained in their own cultures, your untrained artists?
So are we talking about people who are indigenous to Australia? Is that yes. the reference point?
Maybe Koori, I think it might be, yes, because it's capitalized. Yes.
Yeah. So certainly I actually had the incredible pleasure last summer of being in conversation with Carly Alinton Noon, who is and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, a Wari woman as part of the Sydney Science Festival. And you know, part of the conversation that we actually had was about some of the back and forth that we've seen on social media about who owns the identity of Black. And so there's actually some really great scholarship that's coming out about the construction of Polynesian people as Black. And so I will say that where my interests right now lie is in thinking about what does it mean for us to try and own that term and center ourselves in that term, as opposed to seeing the fact that we share that term as an opportunity for linkage and solidarity building. So I've certainly been connecting with people who are thinking about those questions in context, but there are other people who are doing fantastic work on Indigenous astronomies in a variety of communities around the world. And so I continue to be familiar with them, but I also know that those people are doing that work. And so there's other work that I can do in the meantime. Oh, you're muted, I think.
I just didn't want to be interrupting you with my typing. I posted a link to the YouTube talk of Carly Noon at the Sydney Science Festival. So thank you for it's just so wonderful. It's just a constellation of names that you've been giving us, and just this alone. And I think that's for us, we're all learning of new people and new readings to pursue. So here we have, I'm trying to group the questions because they're really coming in last year's lecture. Oh, this is from Andwele Lewis. In last year's lecture, we learned about racism in artificial intelligence and medicine from Ruha Benjamin, and some examples helped bring it to life. Could you give some examples of white empiricism in physics? I wonder if this is when you talk about dark matter.
Yeah, so I think a really good example, I mean, I actually think that the 30-meter telescope and the discourse of the 30-meter telescope is actually like a really beautiful example, because it really is a debate where, like, literally at some point, a very famous astronomer, who I'm not going to make a point of naming because shaming people is not really the goal here, referred to the protectors as a horde of angry natives. And so they're fundamentally constructed as outside of science and not even really people anymore, right? And so I actually think that that's a great example of, you know, my experience of connecting with the protectors. There's a whole media discourse about them and things that scientists say on social media about them. And then when I actually went into the groups and went into conversations with them, they were actually like deeply curious about astronomy, and they were deeply curious about why scientists were so hype about the telescope. And nobody had bothered to just like sit down with them and just answer their questions about like the construction of the telescope, the engineering behind it. There were all of these questions that people had. So they were very scientifically oriented, but being constructed publicly as otherwise. So I think that that's one really good example. I think that in practice, if we're thinking specifically about the experiences of Black women, where we see it happen a lot is in Black women not getting positions in the field, and so not being able to follow up on their work and being gaslit the entire way. So it's like racism isn't real, and so the data that Black women are offering about their experiences is being discarded. And at the same time, those same Black women are being shuffled out of the field. Sometimes it's not like proactively, like I can think of one woman who was actually successful. She was getting positions. She had a very prestigious one, but at some point was like, I'm just done with being treated this way, and walked away and took herself and her ideas with her. So one of the reasons I'm not giving specific examples is because our community is so small that to name any of these folks is really to put someone in the spotlight who doesn't necessarily want their story spotlighted in that way. But there are a plethora of examples. Maybe the one other thing I will add is a project that I'm in the midst of finishing is I received a grant to do what I'm calling the Cite Black Women Plus in Physics project. And so I'm inspired by the Cite Black Women Collective, which you'll see One of the reasons I'm citing so many names is because I've been paying attention to the call to cite Black women. And what I have had 2 research assistants do is build a bibliography of all of the papers by Black women and gender minorities who have a PhD from a department of physics or in a related field. And the plan is to make that a public resource. One of the conversations I had to have with my RAs as we were working on that is some of them didn't really have any papers, or the papers stopped very quickly. And so in a lot of ways, I think that bibliography is going to look like a map of white empiricism in a way.
Oh my, wow. So again, many thank yous, and I think there might be perhaps too many questions at this point, and simply because we need to give you a rest. I do have one from Rebecca Jordan-Young, who's the chair of the Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies Department here at Barnard. And by the way, Africana Studies and WGSS and American Studies are all in a consortium for critical interdisciplinary studies. So yes, it just where we punch together. I really love the model of the white empiricism cycle. Could you say more about the threads of investigation and knowledge that gets lost through the white empiricism cycle? It raises for me the concept of agnotology, epistemology or / epistemology of ignorance. And this seems like a wonderfully focused line of investigation that philosophers who work on agnotology should follow.
Yeah, so I know I just saw in the comments, because I'm just starting. I hope someone takes screenshots of all the comments, because I won't be able to read through all of them. I would appreciate someone on the tech team doing that. So I did see that you felt that I had answered the question, but I will say I am working on an academic text, and I'm having a conversation with the university press editor about this. I'm tentatively calling it Scientists versus Science, but I don't know if it will stay that way. One of the things that I'm thinking through is, one, I want to build out this idea of Black feminist physics as a response to white empiricism, and really build out, like, let's think about what are the qualities of the ideal patriarch, and how is that constructed. But the other piece that I want to think about is what it means to try and own the property of physicist. And so this is a direct reference to Cheryl Harris's whiteness as property. But that's, Rebecca, that's the other piece that I'll share with you, is that I think that there is something, and this relates to the institutionalization question of what does it mean to try and own whiteness as property, to own physicists as property, as a response to white empiricism, and as an inadequate response to white empiricism, because it's an integrationist response with all of the problems that come with that.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm just going to give a shout out. Vernice Anthony saying thank you. And Amy Good, thank you. Also, I can't wait to share in some way with the young Detroit Black and Latina women with whom I work. Rosalind Satchel, excellent, thought-provoking. Stefan Roblin, amazing scholar, Rutgers. Thank you for the splendid, powerful talk, engaging talk and Q&A. Juanita Coleman, dynamic lecture. Gwendolyn Hatton Butler. Sandra Bolger again, thank you. Lewis-Ezekoye, what are your thoughts on Afrofuturism? Wakanda, I'm not sure if we have time. Wakanda, and you may choose. June Jordan also went to Barnard. Kim Hall reminded us. Abosede George, wonderful colleague, history and Africana studies, still buzzing over the Pan-African imports Dr. Jemison was talking about, taking into her space with her. Fabulous. And then there was someone who said China Gallon, deeply moving. She goes out nightly to see if she can find the North Star and think of Sojourner Truth. How wonderful. Deeply
I'm named
moving.
for Sojourner Truth. That's one of my middle names. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
So So let me do the formal thank you so much. I think I've said it. This constellation of names that you've brought to us is I feel like bowing my head in a moment's silence of thanks. You know, and you remind me of the isiXhosa word, inkwenkwezi, for star. The Nama Khoikhoi, call the moon, Kab. All of these different languages had different knowledges, and they saw things differently. Some of the Sirius was called pulls across the night sky. So there are all these knowledges that I think we're trying to ask you to answer for. But that is what happens when you open the universe to us. A universe of questions will come to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Prescod Weinstein, for being our fourth Lewis-Ezekoye Distinguished Lecturer in Africana Studies. And thank you, everyone. Good night to you all. We'd all like to wave to you. So if all the panelists and my wonderful colleague, Celia Naylor, could just bring themselves into view, we would like to wave a goodbye, and a special thank you to Adi Matos and Michelle Rowland, who are our anchor pilot administrators of Africana Studies and CCAS. And then finally, mostly thank you, Denise and Adeyeze, for making this possible. There have been so many people saying thank you to you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And
Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thanks, everyone.
good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Great to see everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.